sex, and that is like the stupidest thing you could possibly ever hypothesize, because everything about it is dangerous. It's dangerous emotionally, it's dangerous socially, it's dangerous because of the possibility of unwanted pregnancy, and it's dangerous because of the possibility of sickness, and that's a major one. I mean, so when AIDS emerged in the 1980s, that could have easily killed all of us. Now, the fact that it didn't was wonderful, but it did kill hundreds of millions of people. So it was no joke, it was a big deal, and AIDS mutated to take advantage of promiscuity. And so the relationship between sexual behavior and the transmission of disease is actually mediated at the biological level. But anyways, back in the 1890s, they had the same problem, right? They had the problem with syphilis. And syphilis is one nasty disease. It can mimic almost any other disease, and it's devastating to your nervous system, and you can pass it on to your children. And so part of the reason that sexuality was heavily repressed in the Victorian period was not only because of the possibility of unwanted pregnancy, the relative poverty of people. You know, back in 1895 in Europe, the average person lived on less than $1 a day in modern terms. You know, it's almost impossible to understand how poor people were. And so sex in a poverty-stricken place is also a lot more dangerous than it is in a rich place, because especially if you were, given the lack of employment opportunities for women back in the Victorian period, if you happened to get pregnant out of wedlock, you were in serious trouble.
Casually with 100 women in a 6-month period, or a 3-month period for that matter, or a 3-week period, I don't care, pick your time frame, and you say, well, and you're ecstatic with yourself because you've been validated by this opportunity, and I'm not making light of that. It's not nothing to be attractive to women like that. It's really something to be attractive to women like that. But it isn't obvious to me that your choice to conduct yourself in that manner enriches your life and the life of other people more in any way than picking one person and actually having a relationship with them. It's only true that that promiscuous pathway, let's say, is better if you can actually divorce sexuality from all the other elements of life. You say, well, it's about variety and it's about impulsive pleasure. Or maybe it could be even slightly deeper than merely impulsive pleasure. It could be shared impulsive pleasure. But I don't think you can do that, because sexuality isn't divorceable from family and from morality and from all the other elements of your life. And if you're mature, you know that. And so you make a decision. You make a decision not to capitalize on your opportunity, not to misuse your opportunities. And you know, a huge part of the Me Too phenomena, a huge part of this battle that's being played out in our culture is a consequence of the failure of men to recognize that. Now, it's not only the failure of men, let me be absolutely clear about that, because, for example, with the example of the sports superstar, the women who are lining up in front of him, parading themselves and offering themselves, are deeply complicit in this pathological game. And so it's pretty clear anthropologically as well that, you know, sexual choice tends towards a Pareto distribution, especially for men. So most men have very little selection at their disposal, and a small number of men have excess opportunities. The question is, what should that small number of men do? And you might say, capitalize on it and to hell with the consequences. And like, it's a powerful argument, but I do believe it's wrong. It destabilizes the society. And so, and I also don't think it does your soul any good, because the problem with treating other people as casual sexual partners, let's say, is that you also treat yourself that way simultaneously. And I don't think that that does you any good, because you're not, unless that's what you want to be. If you want to be a casual partner, it's like, well, that's, I wouldn't say that's a particularly noble ambition. You should be able to do better than that. They are punished for those virtues, and so are less likely to feel confident in their expression or development.
You feel that society nowadays tells men that it's not okay to be ambitious?
I think it's definitely the case that happens. It's certainly not encouraged, it's discouraged because of the confusion between, the purposeful confusion, in my estimation, between power and competence.
You think the hierarchy of the patriarchal system is a good one?
Well, first of all, I'm not convinced that the theory that what we have is a patriarchal hierarchy is correct to begin with. I don't think that way because I don't understand precisely what that means. Does that mean that women had no role in shaping our society? It's only been the last 10 years that people have made the presumption that it's self-evident that what we live in is a patriarchy. What women haven't contributed? Is this the point we're making? Is that women haven't contributed to our society? They just weren't there until what, 1965? And all of a sudden they took their place. All the women before that weren't doing anything at all. It was all patriarchy.
You don't feel that globally men have the better end of the stick?
No. Well, no, I don't believe that globally men have the better end of the stick. Like what? I don't understand why people would even begin to conceptualize the world that way. Better in what way?
Roles of power in businesses, politically, men pretty much rule the world, no?
Well, what about in warfare? What about in dangerous jobs? Who gets killed in war? Who fights in war? Men.
You have women who are soldiers in the army nowadays. Yeah. It's opening more and more.
Yeah. Well, no, we're not going to go down that. Is a woman soldier
not as good as a man soldier?
I don't know whether a woman soldier is as good as a man soldier. I know that in most armed forces, women aren't placed in high combat frontline positions.
Who is responsible for this, the demasculization of the society?
Feminist groups have a fair bit to do with it, and the radical left types that insist that what we live in is a patriarchal tyranny.
What is the issue with feminists nowadays?
They think that the idea that our culture is a tyrannical patriarchy is an axiomatic truth. Well, I think that's complete nonsense. The insistence that sex, gender identity, and gender expression are social constructions, the insistence upon that, the insistence that if there are any differences in outcome, that's a consequence of oppression. That's what's up with them. All of that's complete bloody nonsense.
You have the feeling that feminism has gone too far?
Far too far. But it's the leftist it's not so much feminism, it's really the ideology that characterizes the radical left. Feminism is part of that.
Even though there were still huge inequalities.
What inequalities are we talking about precisely?
Talking about wages, access to
The wage
positions
gap
of
has
power.
nothing to do. The wage gap has nothing to do with prejudice, or virtually nothing to do with it. Single men and women in their 20s. In fact, there's a wage advantage for single women in their 20s. So if there's any gap at all with regards to wages, it's a gap between people and mothers.
Most of the data in all of the countries, come up to that conclusion that a woman who has the same position as a man.
Women and men who do the same job, the women end up getting paid less?
Yes.
And you control for everything else? No, sorry, the data's wrong. There's at least 16 reasons why men get paid more than women. Men work longer hours. If you work 10% longer hours, you make 40% more money. Okay, men work in more dangerous positions. So there's a wage advantage for working in more dangerous positions. Men are more likely to move as a consequence of being required to by their job. So men are... there's more.
I understand what you're saying. You're saying that there were many different points that explain why we come up to that final statistic, but that if you look at the reasons why, then it's because men work longer, because they move more than women, and they
work in more dangerous positions. They're more likely to work outside.
I'll take you on that.
They're more likely to work in STEM fields. They're more likely to work in fields where you can scale. If you look and you say, well, on average, women make less money than men, which is also different than saying that they make less for doing the same work, because those aren't the same claims, then you have to say, well, what are the reasons that are contributing to that? You can't just say, well, it's a consequence of gender discrimination, unless you can only think about one thing at a time. And I would say that's another problem with the modern feminists, is they can only think about one thing at a time.
You said in an interview that to stop harassment in the workplace, a good start would be women stopping wearing lipstick.
No, I didn't say that.
My question is, you were talking about sexual harassment in the workplace.
Yeah.
And you said that one of the issues maybe was women wearing lipstick, because why do they do that? It's to create sexual arousal.
It wasn't an issue with regards to enticement to sexual harassment. It was an issue to what are the rules governing male and female behavior in the workplace. And if makeup is a sexual signal, then why should it be acceptable in the workplace? Well, what the hell do you think makeup is for? Why do women wear red lipstick? Just out of curiosity. Why do they rouge their cheeks?
Because
Why
they
red?
want to feel beautiful.
Look, I mean, the ideas that I'm putting forward here with regards to makeup aren't contentious. This has been studied. We know perfectly well what sexual signaling does, why people wear makeup, why women wear makeup.
But then what I mean is that when you say
Yeah.
these kind of things, a woman may think that, oh, then I might be responsible for what this guy at the office said to me because, yeah, I was wearing makeup. So then I'm the one to be blamed.
That wasn't the point I was making.
No, but do you understand that for a woman watching this and who is a victim of sexual harassment in the workplace,
I
hearing
don't
things
care
like
about that.
You don't care about what she may feel after she
No,
hears you?
I don't care. I really don't care particularly what people feel about facts. What are the rules exactly governing the behavior of men and women in the workplace? NBC, no hugging. Okay, that's a rule now. Okay, how about no sexual displays in the workplace? None. How about that for a rule? Now, I'm not saying that that's a rule that we should adopt, but I am saying that if we're going to have a culture-wide conversation about the difficulties of men and women working together, then we better bloody well make sure that we get the rules straight. Now, when the Maoists took over China, they had men and women wear the same uniform, no makeup, same haircuts. Why? To eliminate all of that. I didn't say that if a woman wears makeup, that's any excuse for a man to harass her. I just said that if she's wearing makeup, that's sexual signaling, and that is what it is.
My vision of it is that, in a way, it puts the blame on women and it gives the guys a free pass.
Well, you can interpret it that way if you want, but that isn't how I see it. And that's also not what I'm implying. And I think that it's appalling that women are treated badly in the workplace by, like, unsophisticated men who have no idea how to govern their impulses.
In a video, you said that the problem with those angry women is that since at the end of the argument you cannot fight physically, you can't really deal with them.
That's not what I said. I said that that's one of the things that keeps conversation between men civil. Women can't argue with angry women. Women are often bullied by angry women.
What I meant was more, you said that, and I'm really like not trying to paraphrase you or to put words into your mouth.
You are trying that directly.
No, it is things that you said that you cannot deal with those.
Yes, but don't tell me
crazy
that you're not
sisters
trying to
because
put
they're
words into my
hysterical
mouth because
and
you've
all
selected
that.
what you're going to ask, and you selected it very carefully with a tremendous amount of forethought.
Well,
and there's a purpose for that. What is the purpose precisely?
I am quoting things that you said.
Why? What is it that you're trying to establish?
Because you said that.
I thought we were talking about masculinity.
We are.
No, we're not.
Yes, we are.
How are we talking about masculinity?
Because I'm asking you what you think of men and of women.
Basically what you've been trying to do, I would say, for the last 15 minutes is put me into a sequence of corners by accusing me of various forms of misbehavior. So why are we doing that? What's the point here?
These are things that you said. My
That's not
job
my
as a
question.
journalist is to ask questions about what you represent and the ideas that you defend.
Your
isn't it?
job is also to select the things that you might ask about in some manner that doesn't indicate a substantive bias. You picked 3 things to talk to me about in the last 20 minutes that were very carefully selected. Like, why did you pick those things?
Because this is my job.
No, not necessarily. You could be asking me, for example, why I've spoken to 250,000 people live in the last 8 months. That might be more newsworthy.
Well, we're not going to have a big debate about journalism, but if a journalist doesn't ask the tough questions, how can you give the good answers?
But it depends on what the tough questions are. It depends on
I didn't
whether
think
or
that
not
they
they're-
would be tough. We're talking about things that you said. I mean, if it's easier to have conversation between men, because there is this underlying threat, of a physical contact.
I don't think it's easier. It tends to be somewhat more civil.
So fighting is the ultimate way of resolving the conflict?
It's a good question. It's a good question. Certain forms of legislation that have been formulated by the, say, moderate left that I think have been beneficial to people. The problem is that, as far as I'm concerned, it's very difficult, seems to be very difficult for people on the left to draw a line between what's acceptable and what's unacceptable, because obviously the left can go too far. And I would say all the emphasis at the moment on diversity, inclusivity, and equity is a sign that the left has gone far too far. I don't think that the radical end of the Democratic Party in the US is going to be very successful in 2020. And I think the Democrats themselves know that. In fact, I'm fully aware of the fact that they know that. That party is actually moderated to a much greater degree than people are currently aware.
Can I just say, I mean, you just said
yes.
Diversity and equality has gone too far. I mean, obviously you're speaking to a country which committed genocide against Native Americans. Justin Trudeau, your leader, is arguably trying to change the politics of Venezuela as part of NATO nation attempts to overthrow governments around the world. You think that's moderate socialist?
Do I think that Justin Trudeau in particular? I don't have
the country of Canada.
Tremendous amount of regard for well. It has its problems, but I lived in the US and the healthcare system there certainly has its problems. It's the radicalization of the left that concerns me and the polarization that's a consequence of that. And mostly it's the emphasis on equity or equality of outcome, because I think that any attempt to pursue equality of outcome is doomed to a totalitarian tilt, because it's technically impossible to equalize outcomes across all possible identity groups. And then there's the problem of identity politics in general, which I think is a real catastrophe, where each person is viewed in the light of their sexuality or their race or their ethnicity, instead of being treated first and foremost as an individual, which I think is the great contribution of the West to, let's call it, interpersonal discourse and relationship and social structure.
If I get to
so any deviation from that's a catastrophe.
If I get to individuals in a second, do you find it amusing or surprising that people that maybe you describe as the hard left often have sympathy for your views on identity as a pretty poor tool of understanding history, and who believe, obviously, that class is one of the greatest tools to analyze society?
Well, that is a strange thing. I mean, it's a sign of actually part of the pathological transformation of the left, I would say. You know, the more moderate socialist types who are concerned fundamentally about economic inequality and about economic class divisions. And, you know, inequality, I would say, is a problem, and it's a very difficult problem to deal with. But to transform that into race and ethnicity-based identity politics is definitely a regressive move. And it's surprising to me to some degree that new story, let's say, which seems to be a combination of postmodern thinking and Marxist thinking, has actually captured the left to the degree that it has. And you can see the consequences of that because of its internal contradictions, and because of the fact that people have multiple group identities, the left keeps devouring its own. You know, I kind of figured out when I wrote the foreword for Alexander Solzhenitsyn's Gulag Archipelago, the 50th anniversary version, and I figured out while I was writing that, you know, because people have multiple group identities, it's possible to identify every single person as an oppressor along some dimension of their group identities, their multiple group identities, and then to justify their persecution. And it's the fatal flaw of this sort of identity politics, and it's a catastrophe for the left, and, well, it's a catastrophe generally because it's polarizing everyone. But
why free and widely available pornography is having on young people, especially men, in our society at this time?
Well, I think it's like Treasure Island in Pinocchio. It's all pleasure with no responsibility. That's deadening. It's parasitical in a sense. And I don't mean that, I'm not making a value judgment. I mean, it's no wonder the young guys are caught up in this, because it's an unbelievably powerful technology. It drove the development of the internet, let's not forget, right? So it taps into one viciously primordial motivation. And so these guys are being blasted by what biologists call super stimuli all the time. So imagine that there's a biological stimulus that has an effect on you, and then you can magnify it. And the typical porn actress, not the amateurs, but the professionals, have their sexually provocative physical elements exaggerated. Mm-hmm. And so men are very visual in terms of their sexual processing. And so, you know, the guys are pulled into it, and they're pulled into it also by curiosity. But I think that ethically it's not good. It's not good. it's an easy out. That's the other thing, you know, is what you should be doing is going out and finding someone to have a relationship with. And if you can gratify yourself with no transformation, but let's say you can't find someone, well, then you might say that's an indication you should change. It is, in fact, an indication that you should change, because what better indication are you going to get than that no one wants to be intimate with you?
Right.
It's the ultimate rejection, and that's partly why men are terrified of it, and I understand that. And I also understand the MGTOW guys, you know, who are just recommending that men don't enter into long-term permanent relationships with women. I understand where they're coming from, although I called them pathetic weasels a while back. I shouldn't have done that.
See, that's where I said, are you
to go out there.
Right, they're actually giving them the back door.
They're giving them a rationale, and I've seen this have very detrimental effects on a number of people already, and partly in my clinical practice, because these guys, the young guys who aren't successful, they're looking for a reason why women are terrible, because otherwise they have to think, well, they're just not presentable, which is what they do have to think, because that's almost the definition of presentable, right? So, and then the MGTOW guys give them a rationale. You know, we are in a gynocentric world and females have got control and they'll like wipe you out if they have the opportunity. It's like, well, some females will do that to some guys some of the time. And sometimes it's brutal. I've had clients who've been dragged through the court systems and just ruined. And I was unable to help them. I did everything I could to maneuver and negotiate and plan and strategize so carefully to get them to do everything right. And it didn't help. I mean, the court systems can be absolutely brutal to men. It's awful.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So the guys that are taking the easy out on that, so to speak, and disconnecting from having those relationships, in a way it's the same, it's just a different out that porn is replacing for that human connection too. So that's kind of fascinating.
This is built into marital vows. I'm not leaving, ever, no matter what. It's like, okay, well, that definitely puts a boundary around our arguments, right? Because I can't say every time you manifest one of your flaws, which you're likely to do just as often as me, well, enough of this. It's like, that's horrible, man. If your whole life is, well, every time you get out of line, I'm out of here. It's like, how the hell are you? First of all, you're not going to admit to ever doing anything wrong. Second, you're going to be on your, you're like a scared cat the entire relationship, because, well, who knows, it could just come to an end at any moment. It's like, you know, people say, well, if the possibility of divorce is open, it makes you free. It's like, yeah, that's what you want. You want to be free, eh? Really? Really? So you can't predict anything. That's what you're after. It's a vow. And it says, look, I know that you're trouble. Me too. So we won't leave, no matter what happens. Well, that's a hell of a vow, but that's why it's a vow, right? That's why you take it in front of a bunch of people. That's why it's supposed to be a sacred act. It's like, what's the alternative? What's the alternative? Everything is mutable and changeable at any moment. Well, go ahead, you live your life like that and see what you're like when you're 50. Jesus, it's dismal. 2 or 3 divorces, your family's fragmented, you've got no continuity of narrative. And it's not good for the kids, not by any stretch of the imagination. And so it's a form of voluntary enslavement, I suppose, but it's also equivalent to the adoption of a responsibility. And there's more to it than that. If you can't run away, then you can solve your problems. Because it might be, okay, well, I'm stuck with you. So how about we fix things? Because the alternative is we're going to be in a boxing match for the next 40 years. That's the alternative. So, and you think you're going to fix problems without something like that hanging over your head? There isn't a chance. You'll just avoid them, because that's what people do. It's really hard to solve problems, especially in a relationship. We're having a fight and I find out that it's, you know, because you were abused by your uncle when you were 5 or some goddamn thing. You know, it's like, it's very frequent that that sort of thing happens. There's your partner is, you know, manifesting some weird anomalous behavior. You just can't make heads or tails of it. It doesn't seem related to what you're doing at all. They don't want to talk about it. And so as soon as you bring it up, they get mad. And then you bring it up again, they even get madder, and they tell you that you're not going to talk about that or they're going to leave. And so maybe you're really, really persistent because you're kind of a son of a bitch, and then they break down and cry, you know, and then they have this horrible memory that comes flooding forward that's completely, you don't know what to do with it, and then you have to sort it out. It's like, you think you're going to do that unless there's a good reason? You have to know, we better sort this out, or we're going to be carrying it around for the next 40 years. That maybe is enough motivation so you'll actually try hard to solve a problem. It's a lot easier to say, well, sorry, we're not going there. But then, good, you'll have it every day, every goddamn day for the rest of your life. See, there's some additional problems with divorce that people don't really grasp when they're young. Like, the idea that you can be divorced once you have children, that's kind of a stupid idea, because you can't. You can find a limited substitute for your initial freedom. But if you have kids and you try to get divorced, the probability that that's going to demolish your life is very, very high. First of all, it's incredibly expensive. So one or both of you is going to come out of that poor. And your market value has declined. Let's say you're the woman who takes the kids. Your market value has declined radically. You're going to be poorer. The man, he's just as screwed because he is now an indentured servant and there's no escape from it. So it's not so bad if you can negotiate a peaceful separation, and some people can, but lots of times if you have a terrible relationship, it's not like negotiating a peaceful separation is all that easy. But if you're at each other's throats, good luck to you. I think it's roughly equivalent to having non-fatal cancer. It is not pleasant. It's a 10-year process, 15-year process. It'll cost you $250,000, and it'll tear a big chunk out of your life. And also, it will really disrupt your relationship with your kids. And you know, you bring kids into a step-parent family, they do not do as well. Step-parents are not as good parents as biological parents, and the data on that is clear. Now, obviously, there are exceptions, because there are terrible biological parents, and there are wonderful step-parents. But if you look in aggregate, it's not that easy to care for children. You need everything you can binding you to them. And if they're someone else's children, mostly they get in the way of the person that you love, right? Well, let's say you have a child, I'll be right out. Let's say you have a child and I want to go out with you. Every second you spend with that child is the second you don't spend with me. And there's going to be a price for that. I'm not going to be happy about that. And if I have a child, you're going to feel exactly the same way. You might say, well, no, I love children. It's like, yeah, sure. Sure you do. I doubt it. You might love your child. And you know, it's pretty specific the way that people love children. So, and the rate of abuse for kids in step-parent families is way higher than it is in biological families. People say things like everyone's creative. It's like, that's wrong, okay? It's wrong. It's just as wrong as saying that everyone's extroverted. First of all, you have to be pretty damn smart to be creative, because otherwise you're just going to get to where other people have already got, and that's not creative by definition. So being fast and being out there at the front of things really makes a difference. And then you also have to have these divergent thinking capabilities, and that's part of your trait structure. And creative people are really different than non-creative people. You know, partly because, for example, they're highly motivated to do creative things and to experience novelty and to chase down aesthetic experiences and to attend movies and to read fiction and to go to museums and to enjoy poetry and to enjoy music that's not conventional music, for example. These aren't trivial differences. And so it's a real misstatement to make the proposition that everyone's creative. It's just simply not the case. It's a matter of wishful thinking. It's like saying that everyone's intelligent. It's like, well, if everyone's intelligent, then the term loses all of its meaning, because any term that you can apply to every member of a category has absolutely no meaning. Now, that doesn't, and you know, the other thing you want to be thinking about here is that don't be thinking that creativity is such a good thing. It's a high-risk, high-return strategy. So if you're creative, you just try this. There's creative people in this room, man. You guys are going to have a hell of a time monetizing your creativity. It's virtually impossible. It's really, really difficult, because first of all, let's say you make an original product. You think the world will beat a pathway to your door if you build a better mousetrap. It's like, that's complete rubbish. It isn't true in the least. If you make a good creative product, you've probably solved about 5% of your problem. Because then you have marketing, which is insanely difficult, and then you have sales, and then you have customer support, and then you have to build an organization, and you have to, if it's really novel, you have to tell people what the hell the thing is. You know, we built this future authoring program, right? And it's available for people online. So how do you market that? No one knows what that is, and that's a real problem. If you write a book, well, then you have the problem that another million people have also written a book. But if you produce something that's completely new and doesn't have a category, people can't search for it online. How are they going to find it? So you just have, and then you have pricing problems, and it's really unbelievably difficult to produce something creative and then monetize it. And even worse, if you're the creative person, let's say you have a spectacular invention, you've got no money, right? You've got no customers. Those are big problems. And so maybe you go and you find a venture capitalist. We start with family and friends, because that's how it works. You raise money for your product. You raise money from your family and friends. That's assuming you have family and friends that have some money and that they're going to give it to you. And most people aren't in that situation. So it's a terrible barrier right off the bat. And then, of course, you're putting your family and friends at substantial financial risk, because the probability that your stupid idea is going to make money is virtually zero, even if it's a really brilliant idea. And so then let's say, well, you get past family and friends and you get venture capitalists involved, because that's often the next step, or an angel investor. There's steps in building a business. Family and friends, angel investor, that's some rich guy that you've happened to meet, some way, who's into this sort of thing and is willing to provide you with some money to get your product off the ground. Well, how much of your product is that person going to take? Well, most of it. Most of it. And then if you get a venture, and no wonder, because, you don't have any money. How are you going to bargain for control over your product? He'll just say, well, do you want the money or not? And if your answer is no, then he'll go and do something else with his money. It's not like there's no shortage of things that you can do with your money. There's a million things you can do with it. So you're not in a great bargaining position. And then if you get venture capitalists involved, they'll take another big chunk, and maybe if they're not very straight with you, they'll just throw you out. Because maybe by that point in the company's development, you're nothing but a pain in the neck. Because what do you know about marketing and sales and customer service and building an organization and running a business? Like, you don't have a clue, so why do they need you? So even if you're successful at generating a new idea and you put it into a business, the probability that you, as the originator of the idea, are going to make some money from it is very, very low. So don't be thinking that creativity is something you would want to curse yourself with. Now, it's not all bad, because it opens up avenues of experience for creative people that aren't available to people who aren't creative. But it definitely is a high-risk, high-return strategy. So the overwhelming probability is that you will fail. But a small proportion of creative people succeed spectacularly. And so it's like a lottery in some sense. You're probably going to lose. But if you don't lose, you could win big. And that keeps a lot of creative people going. But also, they don't really have much choice in it, because if you're a creative person, you're like a fruit tree that's bearing fruit. So you don't really have, you can suppress it, but it's very bad for you. The creative people I've worked with is, if they're not creative, they're miserable, so they have to do it. But, and there's real joy and pleasure in it, and psychological utility. But that doesn't necessarily mean that it's an intelligent. It's certainly not a conservative strategy for moving forward through life. So, and whenever I talk to people who are creative, and you guys should listen to this, because I know what I'm talking about. If you happen to be creative, if you're a songwriter or another kind of musician or an artist or any of the other number of things that you might be, find a way to make money, and then practice your craft on the side, because you'll starve to death otherwise. Now, for some of you, that won't be true, but it's a tiny minority. Your best bet is to find a job that will keep body and soul together and parse off some time that you can pursue your creative thing, because then, well, as a long-term strategy, a medium to long-term strategy, it's a better one. But it's got incredibly difficult for people, musicians, for example, it's incredibly difficult for new musicians to monetize their craft, even if they're really, really good at it. So so anyway, so I say, well, everyone's not creative, and everybody goes, oh, that's terrible. It's like, it's not so terrible. It's not self-evident that you would curse someone with high levels of creativity.